Awesome. Welcome back to Foiling Week 2021 and the Gurit Forum. I am your host, Chris Museler, and we also have my co-host, Bruno Gentoli and Andrew Pindar, live from Lake Garda. The good thing right now, for at least for the forum side of things, is there's not a lot of breeze on Lake Garda, but we just had an amazing session with Sarakita and Oda, both from the Professional Windsurfing Association Tour. And they're 1-2 in the world for the past 5 or so years in the world champions in freestyle windsurfing, professional windsurfing. And they were raced. Now they're getting into IQ foil racing because it's now a foiling discipline in the Olympics. This is a nice segue because, hydrofoiling is new in the Olympics. It's kind of new in the world, and particularly with board sports, and we're doing more board sports. So we're going to be talking about foiling in the media. I write about hydrofoiling sometimes for mainstream media and the New York Times, but our two guests right now are pioneers, really, in the last 2 years or so in talking about hydrofoiling and opening up these conversations to the media. And we're so psyched to have them. It's so rare to have this moment in time where you have the first journalist covering a new topic. So without further ado, one of the editors at large and the gear reviewer for Foiling Magazine, Kel Van Cise. And then we also have Eric Antonsen from the Progression Project, is it?
Yep.
Awesome. It's basically the first podcast about hydrofoiling like ever. And the same thing with the magazine. And man, when I discovered both of these individuals and both of their media outlets, I was like, holy cow, I just heard about foiling. And all of a sudden I have a place to, that feeds me constantly information. And I know, like a lot of people in the world, we can't get an issue of Foiling Magazine or Kel's Friday Pump newsletter fast enough. And man, Eric, I have to tell you that there is not one hydrofoiler on the planet right now that as soon as they find your podcast, they're like binge listening, like they get in the car just to listen to it.
That's rad.
Yeah, so it's really fantastic. So before we get to Bruno and Andrew's questions, because this is new for them too, let's talk about that specialness. Eric, you talk about it, quite often, how rare it is to be early in the sport, and you talk about the equipment. But talk to me about the media side of things in the past 2 years of your opening up your podcast. I mean, are you still just pinching yourself to, how to cover the sport and how it's evolved right now and the response to your podcast?
So I think about it differently. For me, the podcast, because when I started foiling, it was such a desert of information that I started the podcast as a hack to increase my growth curve. And I think that's also why it resonates, because right now the sport is new. So everybody's new. And so everybody's on that path, and the podcast tracks that path. So you can start at the beginning and follow along in the progression over the last couple years. And so I think that's why it works. So I've never really looked at it like a media outlet. I guess it's becoming that more over the last little bit. And maybe I should change my framework. But for me, it's still about trying to understand and get as deep as I can into what I think is the most fun sport on the planet. So,
well, and I would say don't change a thing, because that's the allure. We're learning together with you and we're progressing with you. I love the title because progression is a term that's used new in the wind sports world, really, like in earnest, but across the range, moth sailing and, as early disciplines, the America's Cup and now the Olympic campaigns. But you weren't always a media expert. I mean, how'd you even get into all of this?
So I did the same thing in stand-up surfing, going back probably 2014, 2015. It was the same thing. I was trying to hack the growth curve.
Yeah.
And I saw how cool that was and what happened in the sport. But that sport was very different in that as I entered, it seemed like the popularity was dwindling. And so even though the scope and reach of the show grew at the beginning, you could see it start to taper towards the end. And then when foiling came about, foiling did everything that stand-up wanted to do much better.
Cool.
Access to small waves just made every day on the ocean more fun. But I took everything that I learned from that podcast and put it into the Progression Project. And the Progression Project isn't just about foiling. Actually, when I started it, it was supposed to be about learning, deliberate practice, flow. And then foiling came along, and I was like, I'm going to use foiling as the lens in which to dive into all these other topics. So it's why you get so much of the deliberate practice and the other things that I bring in. And the first 5 or 6 episodes have nothing to do with foiling.
Right. Cool. And again, back to that idea of this moment in time, do you still feel that we're at like a really special moment with hydrofoil board sports?
I do. I do. I think it's like the thruster was just invented in surfing, and we're going to look back, or maybe even before that, maybe when guys first started, getting on fiberglass boards or something like that. Yeah. And it's going to be very special to have been a part of this sport at the beginning, and then also with all the guys that are helping to create the sport. And I bet Kel feels the same way about that, but it is, I don't think there's a lot of opportunities to have a favorite sport, but then also be able to participate in the growth of that sport and influence the direction of that sport at the same time, in some way, or help the sport progress. So I think that's incredibly special.
Yeah. So let's move to the magazine with Kel. The only reason I'm here is because of old yacht racing and cruising magazines in our house in the winter, just pouring through them, and books on sailing. And then the early windsurfing magazines. Windsurfing was in those yacht racing, cruising magazines and Sailing World. And then they got their own magazines. And that's a lot of our exposure was from that. And then VHS tapes to watch and learn versus me watching Eric in Florida on the mushiest, crappiest wave in the world. And he's sending it on Instagram. So what a big change to see a foiling magazine today. Kel, you and I talked about this earlier. It's amazing to have it in print and also be online. How did the magazine come about? Like, did Kai Waggett feel late to the game, or how did you guys even come up with the magazine?
Yeah, so I personally was not there at like the full ground floor of Foiling Magazine. I came into the picture after issue 1 had been released. So Kai's been our editor since day one.
This is in the UK,
person
right?
to work. Yeah. I think he's in Cornwall, or right around there. And he was an incredible person to work with. Really like 10 out of 10 guy. And then Foiling Magazine is part of Waterborne Media, which includes the Kite Mag as well, for those who are familiar from the kiteboarding world. And then that's run by Alex, who's also tremendous. And anyway, so they are sort of the core team. And I mean, now Foiling Magazine, I'm making up a number, but I think we're somewhere between 7 and 10 people on our team now internally. And this is just people who are focusing on Foiling Magazine. So it's pretty cool. But yeah, I entered the picture after the first issue came out. It was actually Brian Finch, who runs the fabled Foil the World account, who put me in touch. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we all cross-pollinate. And anyways, he put me in touch with Kai, because at the time I was working independently, putting together, story content, visual content within foiling, sort of from my limited perspective, if you will, my limited platform as an individual. And so, yeah, there was it was just kind of a perfect match. And yeah, so now we literally just, gosh, what was it, 2 days ago, I think, or 2 or 3 days ago, time's going by kind of fast, but yeah, we had issue number 8 that dropped. We're 220 pages. It's a whole new world for sure. So yeah, I mean, my background that I brought into the magazine, to give y'all some context, is basically visual content and storytelling and design. And so the lens through which I look at everything in foiling and in the magazine is, I think, really quite similar to what Eric was speaking about, in terms of trying to dive deep with certain individuals to gain insights into the status of the sport, the future. So yeah, that's basically my end of the story.
Cool. And I want to get into the weeds a little bit with some details like Eric just touched on a little bit. Kind of halfway through our discussion, we'll get into the influence. You know, when there are only two outlets for, besides it, well, Instagram is the big outlet, right? But when you have two kind of the term I like to use is curated outlets for information on hydrofoiling board sports, you have whether you like it or not, you have a tremendous amount of influence in terms of how the sport is presented to the world. But before we get into that, and so I really want to talk about influence, I want to talk to Andrew. Andrew, your exposure, I don't know if you two know, but Andrew has kind of been very helpful in terms of sponsoring some of the greatest sailors and particularly female sailors in the world for ocean sailing and around the world sailing. He's probably one of the most influential individuals over time, particularly for females in the sport. But as far as media is concerned, as a sponsor, he's very keenly focused on how sponsors interact with media. So Andrew, this is, even though we're talking, I'm excited to have a print version of Foiling Magazine. Eric has just as many eyeballs, and Kel's Friday Pump is an online newsletter that is an aggregator of information. What do you see as their responsibility in terms of exposing the sport?
Well, I'm not sure whether they have a responsibility.
Yeah,
I think,
good point.
It's an opportunity if they wish to tell a story in their own way, and that's what I think is the democratization of the publishing process is what we're seeing with digital technologies. So, I was just thinking that where we're going with foiling, we're breaking through the surface tension, aren't we? We're lifting off and we're doing things very differently, and I think that publishing is affording with digital technologies allows that to happen. So the thought that you can access information and pick it down from a podcast, or you're picking up on the story, you're being motivated by seeing an image on Instagram or some other social media platform. For me, that can be fully reinforced by a 220-page A4 print run magazine. But the trend, of course, is away from printed magazines to online delivery. Because I'm grey-haired and of a certain age, I enjoy both. I must admit that I'm inspired, and with my online shopping and things, I'm using the inspiration of seeing something that pops up on an Instagram.
I'm frozen for a sec.
In my own time. So I wonder whether there's a parallel that we're seeing at the minute between, as I say, breaking free of the surface, as foiling is doing, with the way that digital technologies allow that democratization and different access to be able to communicate that content to a different and a wider audience. Yeah,
and that democratization, I mean, that's what allows someone like Eric to create a show. He 10 years ago, unless Eric was in a publishing house, he wouldn't have his voice, and we're glad he does. Along those lines, we talked about, two curated outlets where you guys think very carefully about the hosts and the questions that you ask, kind of like what we do here at Foiling Week, but like on this topic day in and day out, which is amazing. And it's not just Eric and Kel, you guys know this. It's not just about the actual topic. It's about the people that you have on, maybe even more so sometimes. We have this question in our talking points. Tell us, who's the audience for your content and what are they looking for? Maybe we'll start with Eric.
So I think that the folks who listen to the podcast fall into a couple different ranges, but the largest demographic would be someone who is, looking to progress in foiling, I think. Right. There might be some folks there for the narrative, for the story, for the personalities, but I think for the most part, I don't want to say selfish, but it's a tool that you can use and hop in wherever you are along the learning curve, and then progress along with the shows. I think that it's a training aid. So I think I look at it more like that than I do a media or a curated platform.
But it becomes
yeah.
aspirational for a lot of us. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So
it's aspirational for me. I mean,
yeah.
inspirational for me. That is part of the reason that I do it. I think that, after I have a conversation with someone who is, X levels better than I am, I go out there and I'm working on the same things that everyone at home is working on who's listened to the show. I am probably the biggest fan of the show because, I'm willing to put in the time to get that information.
Right.
It's a hack.
And do you get feedback from your audience to guide the direction you're going, or do you stay pretty focused on following lines of progression for yourself and what you learn from the guests?
It's a mixture of both.
For topic, yeah.
It's a mixture of both for sure. Mm-hmm. I will ping the audience all the time, and that's the one thing. I have a lot of issues with social media. Mm-hmm. I think social media is generally a pretty terrible thing.
Yeah.
But I think for foiling, it has been amazing. If you look at the growth curves in sports now, especially board sports now, versus 15, 20 years ago when I was growing up surfing, you had to wait 6 months, 8 months to see what the new maneuvers were for the surf video to come out. And now Jeffrey Spencer will do something that I don't even know what it is. Mm-hmm. And we all see it that afternoon. And then there are probably 20 guys on the planet that are trying it the next day. Right. And that has just, poured gasoline on the fire of progression. So, yeah.
Well, what's awesome about this is you guys are like unicorns, you're like, you see what we don't see, because you're paying, not only are you paying close attention, but people are giving you feedback as well. So along those lines, Kel, what's the magazine is a reflection of the community, right? And so what is and you told me yourself, you're like, we're kind of focused on surf foil and wing foil and a little bit sup foil. It's Foiling Magazine, but you don't have, at least I haven't seen it yet, you don't have Sarah Kita on there doing PWA slalom. But tell us the community and the vibe of the community, the culture that you see right now. And it's a big question, but you're the Foiling Magazine. Tell us.
Yeah. I think to sort of start from where Eric left off, our perspective in the sport is, rather our position, I think, in the sport with respect to the different media outlets that are there is, we use a lot of the same platforms that everyone uses on social media, right? And it's like we're no different in that way. Mm-hmm. Frankly, we're not even the biggest in that regard. But I think where we do have sort of a different perspective that we bring is we're sort of the guys that went and tried to find the tallest hill to look from and can have a 360-degree view on things. And I mean, just kind of just going off the top of my head, we have our exposure section, right? Just kind of breaking down, getting to your question here about who our audience is, but we have an exposure section, which is curated photos from all around the world from different riders of surf foiling, which can be tow, prone, pump, of course, pump foiling, winging, SUP. Mm-hmm. We go to Rising Up, which is about rising stars, dynamics, which are sort of technical deep dives, backstory. We have wing commanders, tested, inbound foresight, state of play, all these sorts of different sections to the magazine, which are designed to cater to different demographics within our audience. I would say, what's been cool with the Friday Pump, which is, as you mentioned, is this weekly newsletter I've been doing. I think it's now, tomorrow's is going to be the 30th one. That sort of presents an interesting facet to Foiling Magazine where, I can jump in on what's been happening over the last week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And that's actually a great example of where like our content will intersect with Eric's content. Mm-hmm. There have been plenty of times where he'll drop a podcast and I'll link to it in the Friday Pump. Mm-hmm. And so that's a really awesome opportunity to sort of cross pollinate. But yeah, broadly speaking, our content is pretty wide. And tries to be. But as far as like different facets of foiling, different sort of subsections within foiling.
Yeah,
kite and wind foiling are wing. It's all getting mixed up, right? Wing foiling, wind foiling. Windsurf foiling and kite foiling are not something that's at present inside of the foiling magazine. Right. Those, especially kite foiling, would fall into, let's say, for example, like our sister magazine, the Kite Mag.
Yeah. Okay, I got you. You have a place to go with the content.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I personally don't have anything, against those in any way. I think they're awesome. Like I've practiced kite foiling myself, but surf foiling just broadly tends to be kind of its own thing off to the side, which I think is so interesting that we're having this discussion about surf foiling and wing foiling here at Foiling Week, because you guys' background is all with sailing. Right. And so like windsurf foiling and kite foiling would be a lot more familiar to that demographic than say what like Eric and I are most familiar with, or what we practice on a regular basis with surf foiling. But it is really cool to see how everything sort of starts to mesh, and we're able to pull a lot of the knowledge that comes from the sailing world and those who have a racing background, and that sort of starts to trickle down into what we do.
And I was going to say, Eric kind of touched on this idea that, like, I agree with you. Like, social media is an what show, right?
Yeah.
But you kind of alluded to this idea that the foiling community and the surf foiling community, wing foiling community online is seemingly more organized than the sailing foiling community, for sure. It's really fragmented in sailing, and it seems like board sports are unified with the surf foiling community. And for some reason, that's like everyone sharing. Why is we all look at, other board sports communities before this, and there's a lot of negative energy and a lot of positive energy, but it's all mixed up. But you seem to think and show us that everyone's just this one big happy family. I mean, you see our rainbow in our for inclusion for Foiling Week this year. And why do you think that in the surf world, where it used to be a little bit combative, there's always this historic thing, and even in the sailing world, it's very competitive and fragmented. Why on earth do Eric Antonsen, kind of critical of social media, is like, holy cow, but this one, there's like almost no trolls, why is that?
So I think it goes to the difference between foil surfing and surfing, in that surfing is a world of scarcity. There's only so many good waves. There's not a lot of good days. And so there's a lot of competition for the best waves and days. And so that permeates the whole culture of surfing, where foiling comes from abundance. It's very common when we're all foiling together in Florida that 4 of us will take off on the same wave, and it doesn't diminish the quality of that at all. And so you have this synergy of a sport that is incredibly addictive and fun, and a feeling that's better than anything you've had in foil and surfing. And then the fact that it doesn't matter if you're doing it by yourself or with 10 people. And so I think that lack of scarcity, there's an abundance. And also coupled with the fact that it's such a small sport and a growing sport right now, that generally folks don't have a community in their own town yet, or it's just starting now. The WhatsApp groups are starting and all that, but it has been an online community, and everybody's so excited for new information that, I'm sure Kel's the same way. I'm on a bunch of different text threads with, all the guys that have been on the podcast and the whole thing. And we're just sharing ideas because the sport is growing so quickly that, somebody decides or figures out that you can base plate shim, and then that changes the ride. And then, the 15 guys are all frothing on trying this new mod, whatever it is. And so the communication is helping the level, and the lack of scarcity means that, like when I used to live in Costa Rica, I had some of my best friends, and we would lie to each other about where we were going to surf in the morning so there wouldn't be people there, right? Like, it would happen all the time. Like we'd say we're going to surf one break, and then we'd show up at the break and there'd be like 4 of us there. We'd all just lie to each other the night before. Like that doesn't happen in foiling, the more the merrier. And that just, comes across in everything that's happening, I think, right now.
Cool. And Andrew and Bruno, I want to throw this over to you. Kel was talking about, what the foiling magazine is focusing on. Eric has just really brought our attention very clearly to the developing community online, particularly in Instagram, to learn how to learn, and keep frothing. That's a term that is really only been found in surfing and now foiling. It's like the term. My daughter even wants like a little electric frother just to, get psyched before she goes and does something. Andrew, what can we learn? Is the sailing world still has to stay in its lane and we can't even talk about surf foiling? We're not, or can sailing learn a lot from what Eric's working on and what Kel's working on and those communities?
Well, I think that in the previous broadcast we did, we were talking about my little walk this morning and seeing at 6:30 as I walked from down for half an hour down the lake to Melchesney and to the castle, the lake was full of people out there on every different type of foil. And that was 6:30 in the morning. I mean, it was hooning, the wind was blowing hard and people were out there ripping it up. And the beaches were busy and there were people coming in and they were on wings and they were on kites and they were on moths and they were just on. And I think that the genie's out of the bottle for me on that. So I think that the rest of the world of sailing will continue, but I think it can learn a lot of lessons about the way that as we saw here just yesterday afternoon, there was Tom Slingsby and Paul Goodison, Olympians and America's Cup sailors, Sail GP sailors, who are giving of their time, sharing their experience and their knowledge with people who are participating at Foiling Week. And I think that culture, which is, I think the two of you have identified that. You're talking about not giving somebody the duff information about which beach you're going to. You're contributing, you're giving back to the community which you're building. And I'm really fascinated to see what it is that's been the trigger for that. I'm also interested, we're talking about diversity, Chris, but here we are, group of 5 guys on a so we're not exactly a great example of diversity ourselves on this call.
Agreed.
But I'm interested because you've got the power of the pen. Both of you have got the power of the pen because you are able to communicate to an audience. And I'm delighted to say in sailing, out of the UK is a magazine you might have heard of called Seahorse. And Seahorse is the magazine, it's a global racing thing for offshore sailing, really. Comes through the Royal Ocean Racing Club. And those guys have spotted that they want to support the Magenta Project. I don't know if you two know about the Magenta Project, which is about, and in fact, Foiling Week is supporting the Magenta Project. We had a session this morning for the women that are here, for focusing on what they're needing to do to learn from each other and with each other to be able to special issues for females within foiling. I don't know whether you guys already focus on an element of your audience, which is the female side of that. And if you are, great, can you tell us about it? If you're not, are you persuadable to work with the Magenta Project to really advance the interests of women within this side of the sport?
Who do you want to take that one?
Yeah, you can take it first, Eric.
Sure. Absolutely. It has been, for me, it's been a little bit more difficult to get female guests on the show, which I try to do as much as possible. I mean, Annie Starr is one of my favorite episodes. And Annie Reichert, she's amazing.
You just had Julia Mancuso drop.
Talk about a legend there.
That was awesome.
So as much as possible, I just think it's, surf foiling is a very small sport. And then females in surf foiling is a much smaller percentage of that. So it's been a little bit difficult to do it, but it's not for lack of trying,
Cool. And I run into the same thing as a journalist. I talked about this in our first forum. Our first forum was about females professional athletes and what foiling has opened up for them and what are the challenges. Kel, you must have the same challenge that Eric's talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of been interesting because I'm part of the team, and the as a team, we're very much aligned on this, as we should be, right? As anyone should be. And what's been kind of interesting is figuring out, right, how do we address this in like a multifaceted way? And I think for me, one of the biggest drivers has been, which kind of is really broadly like my perspective on the magazine in general, is emphasizing that foiling needs to be it needs to learn from other sports actively, like in real time, to create, and this is where it comes back to our responsibility as journalists, to create this environment and this language and this approach where we do want everyone in the sport. And yes, there are challenges to the sport on multiple levels that have kept it fairly exclusive in terms of it being, largely like white men who are, this is the struggle we deal with all these different sports. Just saying it, addressing it directly. But yes, we are working actively in different facets, and hearing more about the Magenta project. That's something that we want to be tied into 100%. Now I'll stay short on it, but my perspective as a designer is looking, how can I use the platform that we have with this like incredible access to a user database, right? I mean, we know we're learning so much about who's out there in foiling. How can we leverage that? How can I leverage that to to make it more meaningful, to make it more appropriate for audiences who are seeking to become a part of the sport, right? Like who we're talking about.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of bright. It's currently bright, but the future's, I think, increasingly positive.
Right. Cool. And I wanted to, you kind of started this out, Andrew started out with the diversity question, and the answers are familiar, not just in our industry, in these corners of these sports, but all around the world. It's a social issue. And I wanted to start a quick speed round right now. And so while we have you, both of you guys have opinions. We all do. But your opinion matters, or at least we're more curious about your opinion because you talk to more people. So there's going to be 3 topics. One of them was diversity. We just talked about it a little bit, but I want to know your opinion. Eric, safety. So safety in terms of equipment and in terms of, when you have the first foilers in a lineup or the first foilers at a windsurfing spot, if they screw it up, it makes a difference. And if the equipment, the Takuma Kajira, you talked about the wingtips being so sharp, holy crap, what are you doing to us? But it's awesome. So safety, what's your opinion on safety and foiling right now?
I think folks are doing a good job with it. I think that the community is self-regulating to a large degree right now, but there's no place for someone who's learning to foil to be in a crowded lineup whatsoever. And I'm the first guy to say something if I see it when I'm out. And, closing thoughts on the show, I would say 30% of folks mention safety. And I think it's also spot specific in that in Florida, you have endless sandbars everywhere. So it doesn't matter in the same way. Hawaii folks get forced into more crowded lineups. And so it becomes a much larger issue. So I don't see it as much as other folks probably do when you're talking about lineup safety. And that's what I'm most concerned about. If someone goes out there and hurts themselves, that's unfortunate. But if someone hurts someone else, that's can be bad for the sport, especially in like California where things are already so overregulated. And you've had, issues with, sup surfing got regulated to dog patch and in Sano and the whole thing. So I went through all of that. So, leashes if you're around people. And then as you're learning, and this is something that I did not understand at the beginning whatsoever, there is a path to progression in foiling that can minimize the vast majority of the big risk. And it's not what I did, which is paddle out into a chest high day and take off and just get worked, 7 times in a row. That's not the way to learn to foil. You should get behind a boat. You should get on an e-foil. You should learn to fly, especially if you come from a surfing background. It's counterintuitive. Everything's different. And so your habits from surfing will destroy you in foiling. But I think that information is out there now when 2.5 years ago it wasn't, and it was just baptism by fire.
Right. Cool. And Bruno has a question, then we'll go to Kel.
Yeah, what I wanted to ask you both of you guys, do you think that promoting the surf foiling, it's actually pushing people away by scaring them on how dangerous surf foiling is, or the opposite, like reassuring them on in a safe way and not hurt themselves and anybody else? I'm asking because when I started surf foiling like 5 years ago, I was the only one on the lineup. And I think people weren't scared because they didn't know what I had. Like I was the only one with a helmet, and with the years they became a bit more, yeah, you should go down, you should go to the shoulder of the wave. And how do you see this change? It's more positive or more negative towards the surfing community overall?
Yeah.
Who do you want to take that first?
Kel, why don't you do that, and then we'll go back to Eric.
That sounds good. Yeah. And this subject really,
sorry, Kel.
Isn't it? No, you're good. No, I mean, it needs to be talked about. Like this is the, if anything, really grinds my gears in foiling, it's probably this, because I grew up in Hawaii and I've lived in California for the last 6 years, and I learned to surf foil. Well, actually, I learned to surf foil very close to where Eric lives, down in Florida. But I have basically functionally learned to I've progressed in foiling in California, and I think a lot of what I see now, especially during COVID, when the popularity in surfing and in surf foiling proportionally exploded. Yeah, it's very geographically dependent. I've seen a lot of stuff going on in California that I'm just like, I will not subscribe to surf foiling anymore. It's like the thing I love the most. Riding a hydrofoil is for riding a wave, but I can't really bring myself to do it in 90% of the spots in California anymore, because there are 20 or 30 foilers sitting in a lineup of beginner surfers for a wave that's hardly worth it, even on a foil, and the risk, I've seen what happens. It's not good. Anyways,
like Eric was talking about,
try to stay on the rails
that unique California situation that they have, that wave scarcity is even for real for foil boarders out there.
Oh, 100%. And I mean, it's almost getting to the point now where it's between foilers, if that makes any sense. And I'm not saying this in terms of like it's vibey. What I mean is just, scarcity becomes a thing. There's a glass ceiling, But my recommendations, my thoughts on, your question as to how should people approach it, and is it scaring people away? I think there's two things to that. One, yes, and I think everyone should have a healthy respect for that. Absolutely, you should have a healthy respect for surfing, for yourself, for the wave, for the gear, and especially for other people. But also, I think it's interesting to see. Part of what makes foiling so great is what makes surf foiling challenging, is that it attracts a diversity of people again. And so you may have somebody who's trying to learn to prone foil surf, who doesn't necessarily have a surfing background, or they may have no SUP background but learn on an SUP foil. And so there are a lot of these challenges where, frankly, I think Eric's voice and the folks that he interviews, kind of sharing wisdom and sharing basic principles of, hey, here's how you should approach these challenges and do so safely. I think that's really critical. I certainly think the whole learning behind a boat idea, learning on an e-foil is great, but that's like, man, like if I wanted to learn behind a boat, I probably would have waited 6 months to learn to foil. I didn't have a boat or a jet ski readily available, and I didn't have an e-foil available, and so that's the reality is it's definitely a double-edged sword. I don't have an answer. My general response is use wisdom, go slowly, and have respect for everyone. Just because you have a foil and you can do something and you can go connect across, or you think you can, doesn't mean you should right away. Right. So there's my fired up response.
Yeah. And I love that. That goes back to the influence, influencing the direction of things. I mean, Eric, it's right up front on a lot of your podcasts about the respect. Mm-hmm. And we're, oh my God, I can ask you guys a million questions. Yeah. It's like you see the future. So I want to kind of guide this discussion about the future. And, Eric, and even with Kai Waggett at the magazine, you guys started something that you had no clue where it was going, right? Mm-hmm. Your impulse to start the podcast. Kai at least had Kite magazine to have a background with. I hear you, Eric, talking all the time about when you ease into the wing foil. It's hysterical because you have such great foil surfing skills, and it's like tiptoeing into wind sports, where for a lot of us, we dive into it. And now your future is going to look a little bit different because of the influence of that wind sport into foiling. And that's what's so cool about this, is all this kind of cross-pollination. But we know that children are the future. Yep. Like, Michael Jackson and a whole bunch of us tell us, although I shouldn't go in that direction. It's a
dangerous road.
It is a dangerous road. Okay, stick with me here. We had foil training, 2 coaches that are going to be on later to talk about how they introduce the sport. And they both said the ultimate freedom is on a prone surfboard, pump foiling on downwinders. I know, Eric, you talk about shore runners, mm-hmm. Get it where you can in the locations that you can. But it's the same thing. Like the coach said, it's amazing. I finally got the skills right. The flow state that you talked about with, Olympic champion ski racer, same mm-hmm. type of flow state and thought process, where all of a sudden you and the border one, where you look is where you go, and you see energy everywhere in all these waves. And we know that if you give a kid a foil board and some exposure, a kid from any background and any, almost any athletic ability, they can get to that flow state pretty naturally and pretty quickly. So, mm-hmm. Eric, what is your hope with what foiling board sports can do for kids? And what do you think those challenges are in terms of expense and exposure and access?
Well, it's a
That's
broad
huge.
question.
I know, I'm sorry. So kids and foiling.
Kids. So I foil with my son, who's 12 all the time. He's been foiling for the whole time. We got into it together. It's been an absolute beautiful process. Mm-hmm. He's a good surfer, and now he's pretty much foil brained, at least when we're in Florida. We foil together all the time. Mm-hmm. And I think that part of the reason that foiling for kids is fun is because surfing, and I'm sure in something we didn't talk about earlier, but I thought about it while we were on the topic, is that, in the community, and why surf foiling is so much different than, say, maybe even, the wind sports, is that those tend to gravitate towards competition.
Yeah. We talked about that.
Yeah. And so I think that the competition mindset is a little different than if you're just out there for experience. So I think it's a little bit easier to maybe build community around experience than competition, because those guys probably in the back of their mind unconsciously they're going to think they're going to have to compete with someone. They don't want to give up a secret if they learn something, wherein we're just out there trying to have as much fun as possible. And so, if you look at the kids right now, there are barriers to entry. And I think that, I know from my friend group, most of the dads would not let their kids get on a surf foil yet. They deem it to be too dangerous. So I think that there's going to be a progression into the sport slowly. I think that you're already starting to see some hydrofoils be designed with some safety in mind, soft leading edges, rounded tips. I didn't have that same concern for my son, Damien. He's a pretty good surfer. And so he actually picked it up really quickly. He was flying better than I was at the beginning. And so that was really cool. Kids learn so fast. Mm-hmm. And so his ability to adapt from surfing into foiling was really quick. But then they're limited right now by the gear. Kids are limited by the gear, and that it's designed for, I think that foils right now are designed for about 150-pound person. And so as you move away from like the 150 or the 900, the 1050 Armstrong, something like that, into the bigger ranges or the smaller ranges for heavier or lighter riders, they're not optimized.
Right.
And so that's been the really hard thing for my son, is to find a foil that he can surf at a high level, because they lack. They're built for a big guy in really, or a small or a medium sized guy in really big surf generally.
Right.
And so hopefully there'll be a kids line that comes out optimized for someone he's like 80 pounds right now, for someone who's 80 pounds. And that's really going to open up the sport. But right now you're generally going to be experiencing a lot of drag, and it's going to have some limiting factors to it.
Gotcha. We're running out of time, but what I want to end on here is, hey, the two of you are not from Connecticut, and you're both in Connecticut in the United States. And we always like to talk to the guests about what their jam is. But for the next 2 weeks, you guys are stuck in an area where it's not the best foiling area. Are you guys going to go out and play together? And what's your jam right now? What are you going to do?
Well, I mean, I guess we don't have anything written down on paper, but I have been harassing him via text for the last couple of weeks. Yeah, well, I mean, so what needs to happen is you and I need to go to Chris's house, who's not far, because he has really good wind there, and there's actually good downwind. The downwind, I'm not going to get started on downwind. Downwind is what I see as being the future of like surf foiling personally. That's a whole other conversation. There's downwind ability there. The winging, we got to get you. I believe in the wing now. I'd just like to say I had so much hate for wing foiling up until about 2 weeks ago, because every time I'd go out, I'd have to swim back. I'd be like 2 miles downwind. It was terrible. And then it finally clicked with Chris. And so I think, I'm not sure exactly where you're at in your wing progression, Eric, but he's got the spot on lock. Chris is the spot on lock.
Eric, are you going nuts right now? Like,
oh no, I've been super busy, but it's been good. I'm getting a little bit of water time, not a lot.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm sorry to end it here. We can go on forever. We have what's coming up next. We have the Sustainable Moth Challenge. So we have 2 surf foilers talking about downwind surfing, and now we have a whole bunch of students from universities on a 2-year project putting together a foil with flax and bamboo and making it foil and actually perform through. I just can't even compare the two, but they're comparable. So
actually, they were yesterday on the to see their progress.
Good. They were on the water yesterday, Bruno, you were saying?
Yeah, they were. The passion they have, I think, is maybe the same that we have for surf foiling or all these other. They're not even sailors. They went out here in Garda at 8, like 10 past 8 in the evening, with a huge breeze, just to try out their foil that was just repaired. So
yeah, cool. Yeah. So they're frothing too. They can froth on a bamboo moth. Great, guys. So we have Eric Antonsen from the Progression Project podcast and Kel Van Cise from Foiling Magazine. Thank you both so much for sharing all your knowledge and your insight.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Thank you guys. And it's again, we want everyone to meet each other. So Lake Garda next year, we got to get these communities together and get some pump competitions on Lake Garda. A downwind pump run. Not even competition, Eric. Sorry about that. Let's just do a big run. And that was, by the way, that idea versus experience versus competition. That's my biggest takeaway, what we can learn from this community that you're exposing us to. And we're kind of all part of the big community. So from Lake Garda, Chris Muessler from the Gurit Forum, Foiling Week 2021, and Eric Antonsen, Kel Van Cise, Andrew Pindar, and Bruno Gintoli. Enjoy your pasta over there. Enjoy your lobster in Connecticut. And we'll see you on the water, and we'll get ready for the next session. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
Cheers.